to the conversation with Loretto Arnold Gullidge. We are at her home at 932 Dove Lane in Louisville, Kentucky. It is December 5th, 1989. My name is Ethel White. Gullidge, when and where were you born?
I was born in Tazewell, Tennessee, December the 29th, 1906.
And what was your full given name?
Loretto Rose Arnold.
Were you named for anyone?
Yes, I was named for my grandmother. Rose was her maiden name.
And
she was Loretto Rose.
And your name Loretto is Loretto, not Loretto.
That's right. That's the way she spelled her name.
Do you know where she got her name?
I don't know, but a great uncle of mine in Tazewell told me once when I was a child that my name came into the family a long, long time ago from an Italian connection, and that's all I know.
And
he said I ought to know it because I had the name.
And you told me a minute ago that your Latin teacher had a...
My Latin teacher said it couldn't end in an O because that was a masculine ending.
What was the name of your father's father, your paternal grandfather?
Thomas Dickens Arnold.
Did you know him?
Never. He died when my father was about 7 years old.
Which would have been about when, roughly?
Well, I don't have dates in my mind, but it was after the Civil War. And not too long afterwards.
Did you ever hear anything about him?
Oh, yes. He was a congressman from Tennessee. He was in Washington when he married my grandmother, Loretto Rose, who lived in Tazewell. And when they were married, they went back to Washington by carriage, horse-drawn carriage.
So when you say he was a congressman from Tennessee, he was a congressman from Tazewell. He was a congressman from Tazewell, Tennessee, specifically.
Well, he was a state representative in Washington.
Did you hear anything else about him? Did you hear anything ever about his political career?
Oh, yes, I think he might have been what was called a Whig. I'm not sure. But I have read a great deal about him, and of course my father only remembers him as a little boy. But he was the youngest of 12 children, my father was. So he had brothers who were practicing attorneys at the time he was born. He was sort of a character in Washington, I presume, from what I have read. And he believed in things and he talked about things and caused a lot of dissensions sometimes. And when he married, my grandmother went to Washington. He was very proud of her because she was young. I think she was only 16, I'm not sure. But anyway, he had her go to a hairdresser and get her hair styled so that she would be right to being seen in society there. And he was very proud of her. And then one of his cohorts said one day, "You have a beautiful daughter." He didn't like that very much.
Do you know how much younger she was than he?
No, I don't really know, but quite a bit. I would say 10 years at the most. I mean, at the least. Maybe more. I don't know.
Your grandfather would have been a congressman during the Civil War, possibly?
Yes, I think so. Because he was, of course, his home at that time was in Greenville, Tennessee. And he was not for Tennessee seceding from the Union. And many other people in Greenville felt the same way he did, but my daughter, who visited Greenville a year or two ago, talked with a historian there and said there were many people in Greenville who felt the same way that my grandfather did, but that they left Greenville, and my grandfather stayed there even though he felt that way. He had sons who were in the rebel army, who had companies of their own, but he did not believe in seceding from the Union.
You mentioned that you had read a certain amount about him. What did you read?
Well, one of the descendants wrote his graduation thesis at Princeton on his grandfather Arnold in politics.
What is the name of this descendant?
What?
What is the name of this descendant?
Jones, I think. He lives in Greenville. I met him one time. We went back there. He was a very nice young man. Our family was so large. I mean, my father's family. He was the 12th child and youngest. And I never really got to know many of them. But my brother and sister and I went back to Greenville once about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. It was after I had read the thesis that he wrote at Princeton, and I met him at the Episcopal Church there. We just never, our family, our immediate family, never knew much about a lot of the other families. Most of them, I think, lived in Atlanta. The older boys were practicing law in Atlanta. And my father, after his father died, he and his mother moved to Atlanta from Greenville, and he went to high school in Atlanta. The boys' high school, which was considered one of the top high schools in the country at that time. The family lived on a plantation in Greenville, and before the emancipation, my grandfather freed all of his slaves because he did not believe in slavery. But when the slaves were freed, then they had no one to work on the plantation. One little black boy was left because his mother went off without him when the slaves were freed. He was the same age as my father. So my grandmother took care of him along with my father. And I think that they were about, I don't know, it was while the war was still going on because they were playing soldiers in the yard or something. And a Union soldier was resting behind a bush or something, and he made his appearance, and this is what my father tells me. Of course, he was just a child. This is what he remembers. And they ran back to the house. And at night, they would sit before the fire, and Father's mother would read to them. And one night, this little black boy said to her, "Missus, we're awful poor now, aren't we?" And she said, "Well, why do you say that?" He said, "We just got one nigger left."
By this time, had they moved to Atlanta? Or
No, this was in Greenville. This was in Greenville.
Did they stay on the plantation for as long as your grandfather lived?
Yes, they were there when he died. He left a will that specified that my father, who was the youngest child, should receive an education in the law. All of his boys were lawyers. All the girls married lawyers or doctors. One girl married a newspaper man, and that was very bad because it didn't turn out very well. And when then grandfather died, and this will, he had this will, but the family, the financial resources were not too great. The older brothers had all gone to college, studied law in college, universities. My father was supposed to, but by the time he finished the high school in Atlanta, they told him there wasn't any more money left. So he didn't get to go to a law school. He went to I think he worked in a bank as a clerk. One of his jobs was to transfer currency from one bank to the other. They would, instead of transacting it by wire or check like we do now, they carried the actual cash from one bank to another. And he went along with the person carrying the cash to protect him with a gun. And he married a girl in Atlanta and had 2 children by her. But she died when the children were infants.
Do you know her name?
Her name was Taylor. And an aunt, they were from Beaver Dam, Virginia. An aunt took the children after she died and kept them. But my father's mother still wanted him to be an attorney. So after his wife died, she insisted that he go to Tazewell, Tennessee, where he had a brother-in-law who was a practicing attorney, and read law in this brother-in-law's office. As I understand, that was often done then. And they would then pass the state bar and become lawyers. And that's what he did.
What else do you know about your grandmother, Loretto Rose Arnold, who brought your father up by herself? Do you know what kind of a person she was?
Well, I know she must have been a very attractive woman from what I've heard. Her obituary was quite long, and I have a copy of it that was published when she died. And she was in Washington at the time when many historical figures were there. She knew them and had talked to them. But she didn't know how to keep house because she'd never done it. And he didn't believe in slavery, but he had to allow her father in Tazewell to send a slave to Washington to take care of the house because she didn't know how to do it.
Do you know how she spent her time?
Not really. You see, I'm very vague about this because it all comes to me second or third hand because my father didn't remember much of it. Social affairs, I suppose, and talking to, as I understand, I don't know how Washington was in those days, but anyway, she met the prominent historical figures who were there at that time and talked to them.
Did you ever hear who any of them were specifically, or do you just...
Well, you know, my memory isn't so good now, but I did hear them, yes. Some of their sons were named for them, like John Quincy Adams, and I don't know, I just don't remember, but she was there. If I had been going to write a history, I'd look these things up, but I don't remember now.
Do you know if she had to go to work after she was widowed?
Well, no, I don't think she went to work. Of course, she had sons who were practicing attorneys in Atlanta, and I think they had good practices there, and were well known. She went to live with them, I think.
So perhaps your father was living with an older brother in Atlanta.
Well, I don't know what the living quarters were, but they did live in Atlanta while he went to high school. I know that.
Let's move on then to your maternal grandparents. What was the name of your mother's father?
E-double-P-E-S, Epps. I think it was William. It might have been Edward. I never knew him. If I had the records here, I could tell you, but I don't have them right now. He had a general store, as I understand it, from Mother. And he would drive a wagon to Knoxville, Tennessee to get supplies for his store.
Where was the general store?
In Tazewell, Tennessee. And on one trip he brought some bananas to Tazewell, and they were the first bananas they had ever seen. And he had one for each member of the family. And my mother said she really didn't like the banana at all. But she kept taking a bite off of it every now and then because it was such a rare thing to have. They'd never had it before.
Do you know anything else about him? Did your mother tell you anything about what he was like or what his interests were?
Well, I know that one time my grandmother was gone for some reason or other. I don't know what. And Mother was there, and it was something about they wanted a cake or something, and I guess Mother hadn't done much cooking. But she decided to make the cake, and she made it, but it didn't turn out very well. And he said, well, we just won't tell your mother about it.
Do you know anything else about him? Was he born in Tazewell, do you know?
No, I don't know.
Now, what about your mother's mother? What was her name?
Her name was Fugit.
Do you know her first name?
Kate. And she had a twin sister named Jane. And they were inseparable. Jane married a man named Treese first, and he died, and then she married the husband that I knew, who was named Fulkerson. But they were always together in Tazewell, even after they were married.
You knew your grandmother, your mother's mother.
Yes, I knew her. She was the only grandparent I knew.
What do you remember about her directly?
Well, I would go over and visit them and stay a month or two every summer with her in Tazewell. And she raised chickens and had a garden. Somebody would, I think, plant the garden for her, and she would pick the vegetables. And we usually would have fried chicken for Sunday, but she would not kill a chicken. So on Saturday, she would wait till somebody that she knew, some of the black people that liked her, would come by, and she would stop them, and they would kill the chicken for her, and then she would dress it for dinner. She went to the Baptist church, and I went to the Baptist church with her when I was there. And one time they were singing hymns, and I joined in singing, although I can't sing and never have been able to. But she said, well, you can sing in church. She says, you know, I never could sing. I couldn't even sing to my babies.
Do you remember doing other things with her besides going to church?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was there, and I just remember being there. She liked to make tatting. She had a shuttle that she tatted with all the time. And she would go out and gather the vegetables for dinner in the garden.
What kind of a property did they have? They had chickens in a garden.
Well, it was a house on the corner, a lot of two streets. And Oh, I would say the garden was quite extensive. It extended to 3 or 4 what I call building lots now. I went back just recently, and of course that's all built up now. There's no garden there. The house is still there, but what was the garden is all gone. They had no indoor plumbing. They had what they called an outhouse. When my mother was young, the public schools there, or the schools, I don't know what you would call them, the teachers had to find a place to live with people. And so some of the teachers lived with my grandmother. And one was a French teacher there. And speaking of this outdoor plumbing, he had to go to the convenience there, and he knew that my mother was in there. He'd seen her go. So he knocked on the door and he said, "Miss Sally, would you please hurry and come out?"
So this was a house in the town, is that correct? The house was in the town?
In the town.
In the town as opposed to outside the town?
Yes, it was in town.
Do you know what street it was on? Do you know the street's name?
Well, I think they call it Epps now, its name. And my father's sister lived in a house on the next street, which was called Montgomery Street. That was her name. I didn't remember them having that name when I went there, but that's what they're called now when I go back and see that they are. They were quite a rambunctious bunch of children, my mother's family, I guess, because she rode a horse. She had a riding habit. I saw the habit once up in Grandma's storage room, and I thought it was so small I wondered how she'd ever gotten into it. But she enjoyed riding horses, and they enjoyed playing jokes on each other.
How many of them were there?
Oh, there were 3 boys and 3 girls. Maybe 4 boys. My mother was the first girl, and her father was so proud of the fact that he had a girl that he bought her some earrings, and her grandmother pierced her ears when she was just a very small child so she could wear these earrings. And as I say, the school teachers some of them lived with Grandma. And one they were always trying to play tricks on them or something, and once there was one who used his own knife instead of the butter knife to serve himself with butter, and they thought it was so funny. So they heated his knife at the table, so when he tried to get butter, it wouldn't cut because it would melt the butter. And one time they had biscuits for dinner, and they kept asking him if they would have more, and they would say, no, thank you, no, thank you. And she said, "Well, that's fine," says I was worried about it. I didn't think I had enough. And Mother said they could see out in the kitchen that there weren't any more when she kept asking them to have more. An uncle of mine lost an arm. He was a doctor. He lost an arm in the Civil War. And he had
This was a brother of your mother?
a brother of my mother's mother.
Brother of your mother's mother, yes.
My mother's uncle lost an arm in the Civil War. And he had an artificial arm that would strap on. I think he didn't like it and never wore it, but this arm was in my grandmother's attic when I was there. And I didn't like seeing this arm. It worried me because it had the hand with the jointed fingers and all. But what they used to do, they used to play tricks with this arm. They would make it up in some of the teachers' beds, so when they'd go there, they'd find this artificial arm and things like that.
Told you anything else about growing up in this interesting family.
Well, yes, but it's just offhand, I just can't remember. But they were very close knit. Her oldest brother, the oldest child, Isis Boone, left home and went to California. I never knew him. He was there when the terrible earthquake in 1800, whatever it was, they had in California. And up until that time, I think he had been very successful.
Do you remember his name, his first name?
Edward Epps. He married and had children there. But he never came back. I think that he was planning to come back. But he lost most of his assets in the earthquake and never did come back. He wrote to my grandmother. And I think one of Mother's sisters went to San Francisco and saw him. But the other, one brother stayed in Tazewell. He was in the bank there, Uncle Will. I knew him better than any of the others. There were two that went to Knoxville and lived there. And I knew them fairly well because I went to Knoxville and stayed with one of them when I was going to business school in Knoxville.
What was his name?
Walter Epps.
Let's move on to your mother. What was she like?
Well, she must have been she was a character, I guess. She was small. She had naturally curly, dark brown hair and brown eyes. She married my father when she was 19, I guess. But she was very vivacious, I think. As I said, she liked to ride horses.
Now, what was her name?
Sarah. She was called Sally. She didn't like the name Sarah, but my father told her that it meant princess, but she still didn't like it.
What do you remember about her and her interests and the way she spent her time when you were growing up?
Her and what?
Her interests and how she spent her time when you were growing up.
Well, she spent her time trying to keep the family together because we were very poor. They married and had several children while they were in Tazewell. My father was working in the law office with his brother-in-law. She lost her first child, who was a boy. Then she had my sister, and then another boy, and she lost that boy, and almost lost my sister.
What was your sister's name?
Elsie. She's still living. And they had Elsie, and then they had my brother Ernest, and then me. And when they had me, they left there when I was 6 months old. So my memory of starts in Middlesboro after we met. And the first thing that I can remember, I must have been very small because I remember I was being pushed in a stroller, a wicker stroller, and we were going down Cumberland Avenue in Middlesboro, and there was a group from Queen's Daughters Hospital that was having a baby beauty contest. And they persuaded my mother to enter me in the beauty contest. Now, I remember being stood up in the window of this, I think it was a jewelry store, where they had the contest. I remember standing in that window and seeing these people staring at me, standing in the window, because I had won the contest. But my mother said the only reason I won was because all the other children were crying, and I didn't. That's I think, my earliest recollection. Then after that, mother taught school. She had a private school. She started teaching children in kindergarten. There was no kindergarten in the town, and she started a kindergarten. But the parents of these children liked it so well that they kept persuading her to add another year. So she kept these same children until they were ready for the 7th grade, I think. And at that time, then she took a job as librarian in the Carnegie Public Library there, and they had to go to public schools.